Crime Tales, Episode 1, The Rise and Fall of the Barker-Karpis Gang, January 16th, 1935. Dawn breaks over Lake Weir, Florida. Inside a small cottage, a mother and her son sleep peacefully. Outside, federal agents surround the house, weapons drawn. What happens next will become one of the most controversial shootouts in FBI history and spark a debate that continues to this day. Was Ma Barker really the criminal mastermind J. Edgar Hoover claimed she was? Or was she simply a mother who loved her sons too much? The truth, as you'll discover today, is far more complicated than the legend. Welcome to Crime Tales, the podcast where we explore the most fascinating true crime stories in American history. I'm your host, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Whether you're folding laundry, preparing dinner, or finally getting that quiet moment with your coffee, you're in for quite a story. Today, we're traveling back to the 1930s, to the height of the Great Depression, when America was gripped by fear of a new kind of celebrity criminal. This is the story of the Barker-Karpis Gang, one of the most violent, sophisticated, and misunderstood criminal organizations of the Depression era. It's a tale of desperate times, family loyalty taken to deadly extremes, corrupt police officers, groundbreaking forensic science, and a mother whose true role in her son's crimes has been debated for nearly 90 years. Over the next hour, we'll explore how a group of small-time criminals became public enemy number one. We'll examine the kidnappings that shocked a nation and changed federal law enforcement forever. And we'll investigate whether Ma Barker was truly the bloody mama of legend, or whether her reputation was manufactured to justify her death. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you back to a time when bank robbers were folk heroes, the FBI was just learning its trade, and one family became synonymous with the criminal underworld. Part 1, Desperate Times, the world that created the Barker-Karpis Gang. Before we can understand the Barker-Karpis Gang, we need to understand the America they lived in, because their story doesn't begin with violence or crime. It begins with poverty, desperation, and a country in crisis. Picture this. It's the 1930s. The Great Depression has devastated America. 1 in 4 Americans is unemployed. Families are losing their farms, their homes, their savings. People are standing in bread lines just to eat. The American dream feels like a cruel joke. And into this desperate landscape emerge a new kind of celebrity, the bank robber. Think about that for a moment. While ordinary Americans watched their life savings disappear when banks failed, these outlaws were hitting those same banks. To many struggling people, bank robbers weren't villains. They were Robin Hoods striking back at the institutions that had failed them. John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson. These names became household words, and right there among them, the Barker-Karpis Gang. But let's go back even further to where the story really begins, to a poor family in Missouri, struggling to survive even before the Depression hit. Arizona Donnie Clark was born in 1873 in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri. Now, I want you to imagine what life was like for a woman in rural Missouri in the late 1800s. Hard doesn't even begin to describe it. She married George Barker when she was just 19 years old, and together they would have 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, who everyone called Doc, and the youngest, Fred. The family moved around constantly from Missouri to Oklahoma to Kansas, always looking for work, always struggling. George Barker worked as a gas station attendant, a farmhand, whatever he could find. But there was never enough money, never enough of anything. Arizona, or Kate, as most people called her, though history would remember her as Ma, was fiercely protective of her boys. Fiercely protective. By all accounts, she thought they could do no wrong. When they got in trouble at school, she blamed the teachers. When they got in trouble with the law, she blamed society. She made excuses for them, defended them, enabled them. And those boys needed a lot of defending. Herman, the oldest, was the first to turn to crime, then Lloyd, then Doc, and finally Fred, who would become the most violent of them all. One by one, Kate Barker's sons became criminals, and by 1910, when Fred was just 7 years old, all 4 Barker brothers were already involved in criminal activities. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. What about their father? Where was George Barker in all this? Well, George seems to have been a quiet, passive man who was completely overshadowed by his wife. He worked his modest jobs, tried to stay out of trouble, and eventually, after watching his son spiral into crime, he left the family entirely around 1928. He'd had enough. But Ma never abandoned her boys. Not when they were arrested, not when they went to prison, not when they became murderers. Her loyalty was absolute, unwavering, and as we'll see, ultimately fatal. Now, while the Barker boys were cutting their teeth on petty crime in the Midwest, another young criminal was making a name for himself. His name was Alvin Karpowicz, though he'd later shorten it to something that rolled off the tongue a bit easier: Alvin Karpis. Karpis was born in 1907 in Montreal, Canada, to Lithuanian immigrant parents. The family moved to Topeka, Kansas when Alvin was young, searching for that same American dream that seemed to elude so many immigrant families. And just like the Barkers, the Karpis family struggled. But Alvin Karpis was different from the Barker boys. He wasn't just a thug, he was smart, calculating, methodical. Where the Barkers relied on violence and intimidation, Karpis used his brain. He planned. He strategized. He thought several steps ahead. He also had a nickname that tells you everything you need to know about him: Creepy. Some say it was because of his cold reptilian stare. Others say it was his unsettling ability to remain calm and collected even in the most dangerous situations. Either way, Alvin Creepy Karpis was not someone you wanted to cross. By his early 20s, Karpis had already been in and out of jail several times. Burglary, theft, the usual progression for a career criminal. And in 1931, he found himself in the Kansas State Penitentiary. And that's where it happened. That's where Alvin Karpis met Fred Barker. I want you to imagine this meeting. On one side, you have Fred Barker, violent, impulsive, loyal to his family above all else. On the other, you have Alvin Karpis, intelligent, calculating, always thinking about the next score. They should have been oil and water, but instead they recognized something in each other. Fred saw in Karpis the brains that could make them rich. Karpis saw in Fred the muscle that could protect him and carry out his plans. It was a partnership that would terrorize the Midwest for the next 5 years. When they were both released in March of 1931, they didn't waste any time. They immediately began planning their first jobs together, and that's when the Barker-Karpis Gang was truly born. Now here's where Ma Barker enters the picture in earnest, because when Fred got out of prison and teamed up with Karpis, guess who was right there with them? That's right, Ma Barker began traveling with the gang, providing cover for their movements. Think about it. What could look more innocent than a mother traveling with her sons? In the 1930s, when family was everything and mothers were seen as wholesome and pure, nobody looked twice at a middle-aged woman and her boys checking into hotels or renting houses. She was the perfect cover, the ultimate disguise. But was she more than that? Was she actually planning their crimes, directing their operations, masterminding their kidnappings? We'll dig deep into that question later, but for now, just know that Ma Barker was there, in the thick of it, from the very beginning. The gang started small, bank robberies in Kansas and Missouri. They'd hit a bank, grab whatever cash they could, and disappear before the local police could respond. Remember, this was before the FBI had real authority over bank robberies. This was before forensic science could track criminals across state lines. If you could get out of town fast enough, you could usually get away with it. But the Barker-Karpis Gang had something that set them apart from other criminals of the era. They had connections, they had a network, and most importantly, they had a safe haven, a place where they could hide, plan, and rest between jobs. That place was St. Paul, Minnesota. Now I know what you're thinking. St. Paul? That nice, quiet Midwestern city? What made it a haven for criminals? Well, let me tell you about a man named Thomas Brown. Thomas Brown was the police chief of St. Paul, and he was as corrupt as they come. In fact, St. Paul had what criminals called the O'Connor system, named after a former police chief. The system was simple. Criminals could live in St. Paul without being arrested, as long as they paid bribes to the police and didn't commit crimes within the city limits. You could be public enemy number one, but as long as you paid your protection money to Chief Brown and kept your nose clean in St. Paul, you were safe. Can you imagine that? A major American city essentially run by criminals and corrupt cops. It sounds like something out of a movie, but it was absolutely real. The Barker-Karpis Gang took full advantage. They made St. Paul their base of operations, paying regular bribes to Chief Brown. And Brown didn't just protect them, he helped them. He provided intelligence. He warned them about raids. He even, according to some historians, helped them plan their kidnappings. So now we have all the pieces in place. We have desperate economic times. We have violent, experienced criminals. We have a criminal mastermind in Alvin Karpis. We have Ma Barker providing cover and motherly devotion. And we have a corrupt police chief providing protection and guidance. What happens when you combine all those elements? You get one of the most violent and successful criminal organizations in American history. You get robberies, kidnappings, and murders that will shock the nation. You get a crime spree that will force the federal government to completely rethink how it fights crime. And you get a story that, nearly 90 years later, still fascinates and horrifies us in equal measure. We'll get into their crimes in just a moment. But first, let me remind you that if you're enjoying crime tales, please take a moment to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell your friends, your book club, your neighbors. And if you have thoughts about today's episode, I'd love to hear from you on social media. All right, let's talk about what the Barker-Karpis Gang actually did. Part 2, Blood and Money, the gang's criminal operations. The year is 1931. Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis have just gotten out of prison. They're broke, they're desperate, and they're ready to make up for lost time. Their first jobs together are relatively small. Store robberies, burglaries, nothing that would make national headlines. But that changes quickly, because Fred Barker isn't just a thief. He's violent, dangerously violent, and he's willing to kill anyone who gets in his way. The gang's first murder happens in Pocahontas, Arkansas. The target? Town Marshal Manly Jackson. Now, I couldn't find the exact details of why they killed Marshal Jackson, whether he stumbled onto them during a robbery or whether they targeted him specifically. But what matters is this: they crossed a line. They weren't just robbers anymore. They were killers. And once you cross that line, it gets easier to cross it again, and again, and again. Just a few months later, in December of 1931, the gang is in West Plains, Missouri. They're planning to rob a store when Sheriff C. Roy Kelly gets in their way. They shoot him dead. Another law enforcement officer. Another murder. Another family destroyed. By early 1932, the Barker-Karpis Gang has built up a network of about 25 people. Criminals who work with them on various jobs, provide hideouts, fence stolen goods. It's a well-oiled machine, and they're about to hit their stride, December 16th, 1932. Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Third Northwestern National Bank. It's a cold winter morning, and the bank is just opening for business. Inside, customers are starting their day, depositing checks, withdrawing money for Christmas shopping. Everything seems normal, but outside, the Barker-Karpis Gang is watching, waiting, planning. They enter the bank with guns drawn. Karpis, Fred Barker, Doc Barker, who had joined the gang after being paroled from Oklahoma State Penitentiary, and several other gang members. They're organized. They're efficient. They know exactly what they're doing. Everyone on the floor! This is a robbery! Now, during bank robberies in this era, gang members would be stationed outside as lookouts. Their job was to watch for police and warn the robbers inside if law enforcement showed up. For this job, the gang had hired a criminal named Larry Duvall as their lookout. Larry Duvall was a psychopath. There's no other way to put it. He was violent, unpredictable, and trigger-happy. And on this cold December morning, he would prove just how dangerous he was. As the robbery is happening inside the bank, two Minneapolis police officers, Ira Evans and Leo Gorski, happen to be driving by on patrol. They see something suspicious, maybe a nervous lookout, maybe someone running. We don't know exactly what tipped them off, but they stop their car to investigate, and that's when Larry Duvall opens fire. Officer Ira Evans is killed instantly. Officer Leo Gorski is shot and seriously wounded, though he'll survive. And just like that, another murder is added to the gang's body count. The gang escapes with the money, and they get away clean. By the time backup arrives, they're long gone, disappeared into their network of safe houses. I want to pause here for a moment and talk about what this meant, because we're talking about real people, real families. Officer Ira Evans was 33 years old. He had a wife and children. He was just doing his job, just trying to keep his community safe, when he was gunned down by criminals who cared more about money than human life. And he wasn't the only one. Throughout their criminal career, the Barker-Karpis gang would kill at least 10 people that we know of. 10 families shattered, 10 lives cut short, all for money. I think it's important that we remember that, because when we talk about Depression-era gangsters, there's sometimes this tendency to romanticize them, to see them as Robin Hoods or anti-heroes. But the Barker-Karpis gang wasn't robbing from the rich to give to the poor. They were killing innocent people to line their own pockets. All right, so by early 1933, the gang has pulled off multiple successful bank robberies. They're making good money. They've got their safe haven in St. Paul. They've got protection from Chief Brown. Life is good. But there's a problem. Bank robberies are getting riskier. See, the federal government is starting to pay attention to the crime wave sweeping the country. More resources are being devoted to catching bank robbers. New laws are being passed. The FBI, which at this point is still fairly new and relatively powerless, is starting to get more authority. And Alvin Karpis, being the smart criminal he is, sees the writing on the wall. Bank robberies are becoming too dangerous. Too much heat. Too many cops. They need a new racket. And that's when someone, and here's where it gets interesting, suggests kidnapping. Now, according to historical accounts, it was actually Police Chief Thomas Brown who first suggested the gang switch from bank robbery to kidnapping. Let that sink in for a moment. The chief of police, the man sworn to uphold the law, is advising criminals on how to commit more lucrative crimes. Brown's reasoning was simple. Kidnapping was less risky than bank robbery. You didn't have to worry about alarms, guards, or police patrols. You just grabbed someone wealthy, demanded a ransom, and if the family paid, which they usually did, everyone walked away. Well, except for the victim's family, who'd be traumatized and bankrupt. But Brown wasn't concerned about that. So in mid-1933, the Barker-Karpis gang makes a decision that will change everything. They're going to become kidnappers, and they're going to start with a man named William Hamm Jr. Part 3, the Hamm kidnapping. Terror in broad daylight. William Hamm Jr. was 39 years old in June of 1933. He was the president of Hamm's Brewing Company, one of the most successful breweries in Minnesota. This was just after Prohibition had ended, so the brewing industry was booming again. Hamm was wealthy, well-known, and, most importantly for the gang, vulnerable. June 15, 1933. It's a warm summer day in St. Paul. William Hamm leaves his office around noon, like he does every day, to walk home for lunch. It's a routine he's followed for years. Same route, same time. The gang has been watching him. They know his schedule better than he does. Hamm is walking down the street, probably thinking about lunch, maybe reviewing business matters in his head, when suddenly a car pulls up beside him. Before he can react, two men jump out. Doc Barker and a gangster named Charles Fitzgerald grab him. They shove a pillowcase over his head, then goggles to make sure he can't see anything. They push him into the car, which is being driven by Alvin Karpis himself, and speed away. The entire kidnapping takes less than a minute. One moment, William Hamm is walking home for lunch on a beautiful June day. The next moment, he's blind, terrified, and being driven to an unknown location by men he can't see. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the terror of that moment? The gang takes Hamm to a house they've rented in Bensenville, Illinois, about 400 miles away. They keep him blindfolded the entire time. They don't hurt him. They need him alive and unharmed if they want that ransom paid. But they make it clear that if his family doesn't cooperate, he's a dead man. The ransom demand is delivered to Hamm's brewery, $100,000. That's roughly $1.8 million in today's money. A fortune. And the gang makes it clear, pay up or you'll never see William Hamm alive again. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Hamm family wants to pay. They want their son and brother back. But there's a problem. They need time to gather that much cash. Remember, this is 1933. Banks had failed all over the country during the Depression. People were wary of keeping large amounts of cash in banks. Gathering $100,000 in actual physical currency would take time, several days at least. So the family negotiates. They need 4 days. The gang agrees. After all, what's a few days when you're waiting for the biggest payday of your life? Can you imagine what those 4 days were like for William Hamm? Blindfolded in a strange house, listening to the voices of his captors, not knowing if he'd live or die, not knowing if his family could raise the money, not knowing if the gang would keep their word even if they did. And what about his family? The agony of not knowing where he was, if he was hurt, if he was even still alive. The frantic scramble to gather cash from every source they could think of. The fear that if they called the police, the gang might kill William out of revenge. It's the stuff of nightmares. But on June 19th, 4 days after the kidnapping, the Hamm family delivers the ransom. $100,000 in used bills, handed over to gang members at a predetermined location. And remarkably, the gang keeps their word. Later that same day, William Hamm is released near Wyoming, Minnesota, still wearing his blindfold. He stumbles to a nearby road, tears off the blindfold, and flags down a passing car. He's alive. He's unharmed. He's home. The Barker-Karpis Gang has just pulled off one of the most successful kidnappings in American history. They've got $100,000. They've got away clean, and they've proven that their new business model works. But they've also made a crucial mistake. They've attracted the attention of the federal government. See, kidnapping is a federal crime. It crosses state lines. It's not something that local police can handle on their own. This is an FBI matter, and the FBI, under the direction of a young, ambitious bureaucrat named J. Edgar Hoover, is very interested in the Hamm kidnapping. Hoover sees opportunity here. The FBI has been criticized as ineffective, as a bunch of accountants who can't catch real criminals. But if they can solve a high-profile kidnapping, if they can bring down a major criminal gang, that would change everything. That would make Hoover and the FBI into heroes. So the FBI launches an investigation. They interview William Hamm extensively, trying to get any detail that might help identify the kidnappers. But Hamm was blindfolded the entire time. He can't identify anyone. He can't even describe the house where he was held. The FBI needs something more. They need evidence. Hard physical evidence that can link specific individuals to the crime. And they're about to get it. But not from the Hamm kidnapping. From an even bigger job the gang is planning. The gang divides up the Hamm ransom money. Everyone gets their cut. Ma Barker gets a share too, because even though we still don't know exactly what her role was, she was definitely part of the operation in some capacity. She was there. She was involved. The gang members go on spending sprees, new cars, new clothes, expensive dinners, fancy hotels. They're living large. And that $100,000, as much as it is, won't last forever. Not the way they're spending it. So by late 1933, they're looking for another score, another kidnapping. But this time, they want to go even bigger. This time, they want $200,000. And they have the perfect target in mind, a wealthy banker with connections all the way to the White House. His name was Edward George Bremer, Jr. Part 4. The Bremer Kidnapping. The crime that changed everything. Edward Bremer was 37 years old in January of 1934. He was the president of the Commercial State Bank in St. Paul. His family was wealthy, influential, and well-connected. In fact, Edward Bremer's family was friendly with President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. When the Barker-Karpis Gang decided to kidnap Edward Bremer, they weren't just targeting a wealthy businessman. They were targeting someone whose kidnapping would become a national crisis. And they had no idea just how much heat they were about to bring down on themselves. January 17, 1934. It's a cold winter morning in St. Paul. Edward Bremer is driving his 9-year-old daughter Betty to school, just like he does every morning. It's a routine, a habit, and the gang has been watching. After dropping Betty off at school, Bremer is driving back home when another car forces him off the road. Before he knows what's happening, men are surrounding his car. They're armed, they're aggressive, and they're dragging him out of his vehicle. One of the kidnappers hits Bremer over the head, knocking him semi-conscious. They shove him into their car and speed away, leaving Bremer's empty vehicle sitting at an intersection. Betty's father has just vanished in broad daylight. The gang takes Bremer to Bensonville, Illinois, the same house where they'd held William Hamm 7 months earlier. They're nothing if not efficient. Why rent a new safe house when you've got one that already worked? But this kidnapping is different from the Hamm job. This time, they're rougher with their victim. Bremer has been injured in the kidnapping. That blow to the head left him bleeding and disoriented. The gang treats his wound, but only because they need him alive to collect the ransom. The ransom demand goes out, $200,000, double what they got for Hamm. That's roughly $3.6 million in today's money. It's an astronomical sum, even for a family as wealthy as the Bremers. But there's a problem, a big problem. None. President Roosevelt has just learned that his friend's son has been kidnapped, and he's furious. He goes on national radio, one of his famous fireside chats, and talks about the wave of kidnappings sweeping the nation. He calls it a national crisis. He promises that the full force of the federal government will be brought to bear on these criminals. The FBI mobilizes. J. Edgar Hoover personally takes charge of the investigation. Every available agent is assigned to the case. This isn't just another kidnapping anymore. This is a matter of national importance, and that means the Barker-Karpis Gang is in trouble. Big trouble, but they don't know it yet. All they know is they're waiting for their $200,000. The Bremer family is desperate. They want Edward back, but gathering $200,000 in cash is even harder than raising $100,000 had been. It takes time. Days turn into a week turns into 2 weeks. Edward Bremer is held captive for 21 days. 3 weeks of not knowing if he'll ever see his family again. Meanwhile, the FBI is working every angle. They're interviewing witnesses, they're checking out leads, and they're analyzing every piece of physical evidence they can find. This is where the story gets really fascinating, because the Barker-Karpis Gang is about to be brought down by something they can't see, something they don't even know they're leaving behind. Fingerprints. Now, I know fingerprints don't sound exciting. They're not car chases or shootouts. But trust me, this is one of the most important parts of our story. Because what happens with the Bremer kidnapping ransom notes will revolutionize criminal investigation in America. Let me explain. The gang sends several ransom notes to the Bremer family with instructions on how to deliver the money. These notes are handled by the kidnappers, written on, folded, placed in envelopes. And every time someone touches paper, they leave behind something invisible to the naked eye, their fingerprints in the form of perspiration and oils from their skin. The FBI knows this. They've been experimenting with fingerprint technology for years, but until now they've never been able to successfully raise fingerprints from paper. The problem is that fingerprints on paper are latent, meaning they're invisible. You can't just look at a piece of paper and see fingerprints. You need a chemical process to make them visible. And in 1933, no one had figured out a reliable method to do that. But FBI scientists had been working on something, a technique using silver nitrate. Here's how it works, and I promise I'll keep this simple. When you touch something, the sweat from your fingertips contains sodium chloride. That's table salt. If you treat paper with a silver nitrate solution, the silver nitrate reacts with the sodium chloride in the fingerprints. This chemical reaction produces silver chloride, which appears white and is visible to the naked eye. It's brilliant. It's groundbreaking. And the FBI is about to use it for the first time ever on the Bremer ransom notes. September 6, 1933, actually before the Bremer kidnapping, they'd been practicing on the Hamm ransom notes. The FBI laboratory successfully uses the silver nitrate method to raise latent fingerprints, and suddenly the impossible becomes possible. They apply this technique to all the ransom notes from both kidnappings. And what do they find? Fingerprints, multiple fingerprints, including prints from Alvin Karpis, Doc Barker, and Charles Fitzgerald. For the first time in history, the FBI has hard scientific evidence linking specific individuals to kidnapping cases. They know who they're looking for. They have names. They have faces. The Barker-Karpis Gang has just been identified. But there's one more piece of evidence that seals the deal. When investigators examine the route they believe the kidnappers took with Edward Bremer, they find an empty gas can on the side of the road. It's been discarded carelessly, probably after being used to refuel one of the getaway cars. On that gas can is a fingerprint, a clear, identifiable fingerprint. It belongs to Doc Barker. The FBI now has the evidence they need, but they still have to find the gang, and that's not going to be easy. Remember, the gang is still holding Edward Bremer. 3 weeks have passed. Finally, on February 7th, 1934, the Bremer family delivers the ransom, $200,000 in marked bills. The FBI has recorded the serial numbers of every single bill, hoping they can trace the money when the gang starts spending it. And just like with William Hamm, the gang keeps their word. Edward Bremer is released near Rochester, Minnesota. He's alive. He's been traumatized but not seriously harmed. He returns to his family. But the nightmare isn't over for the Barker-Karpis gang. It's just beginning. Because now the FBI knows who they are. The FBI has their fingerprints. The FBI has the serial numbers from the ransom money. And the FBI has a mandate from the President of the United States to bring these criminals to justice. The Barker-Karpis gang has just become public enemy number one. Now, the gang isn't stupid. Alvin Karpis especially has always been careful, always thinking ahead. And when he learns that the FBI has developed this new fingerprint technology, he makes a drastic decision. He's going to have his fingerprints removed, surgically. In 1934, Karpis seeks out an underworld doctor named Joseph Moran. Now, Dr. Moran was not your typical physician. He was a corrupt doctor who provided medical services to criminals, treating gunshot wounds, performing plastic surgery to change appearances, and yes, removing fingerprints. The procedure is exactly as gruesome as it sounds. Moran uses acid and surgical tools to burn and scrape away the skin on Karpis's fingertips, destroying the unique ridge patterns that make up fingerprints. It's agonizingly painful. It takes weeks to heal, and it leaves Karpis's fingertips scarred and damaged. But it works. Alvin Karpis no longer has identifiable fingerprints. 2 other gang members undergo the same procedure. They're that desperate to avoid identification. Think about what that tells you about how scared they were of this new technology. But destroying their fingerprints doesn't erase the evidence that's already been collected. The FBI still has the prints from the ransom notes. They still know who committed the kidnappings. And they're closing in. Throughout 1934, the FBI is in a race against time. They're not just hunting the Barker-Karpis gang. They're hunting all the major public enemies of the era. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde. And one by one, these criminals are being killed or captured. July 22, 1934. John Dillinger is shot and killed by FBI agents outside a movie theater in Chicago. October 22, 1934. Pretty Boy Floyd is killed in a shootout with FBI agents in Ohio. November 27, 1934. Babyface Nelson is killed in a gun battle with FBI agents in Illinois. The FBI is winning the war on crime. The age of the celebrity criminal is coming to an end, and the Barker-Karpis gang knows they're next on the list. In fact, the very day after Babyface Nelson is killed, November 28, 1934, Alvin Karpis is designated public enemy number one. He's now the most wanted man in America. The gang is scattered, hiding in various locations across the country. Ma Barker and Fred are in Florida. Doc Barker is moving between Chicago and other cities. Karpis is constantly on the move, never staying in one place for too long. They all know the end is coming. They just don't know when or how. And for Ma and Fred Barker, holed up in a cottage by Lake Weir, Florida, the end will come on a cold January morning in 1935. We'll get to that dramatic shootout in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you about something that might interest you. Welcome back to Crime Tales. When we left off, the Barker-Karpis gang was on the run, scattered across the country, with the FBI closing in. Now let's talk about what happened next. Part 5. The Lake Weir Shootout. The death of May and Fred Barker. January 8, 1935. Chicago, Illinois. FBI agents, acting on a tip, raid an apartment on the north side. They're looking for members of the Barker-Karpis gang, and they hit the jackpot. Inside the apartment, they find Doc Barker and a gang associate named Byron Bolton. There's also another man there, Russell Gibson, who went by the nickname Slim Gray. And Slim Gray decides he's not going to prison. He pulls a gun and opens fire on the agents. It's a fatal mistake. The FBI returns fire, and Russell Gibson is killed instantly. Doc Barker and Byron Bolton, seeing how this is going to end, surrender. They're arrested and taken into custody. Now this is huge for the FBI. Doc Barker is one of the top members of the gang. He's been involved in both kidnappings, he's facing life in prison, maybe even execution. And the FBI thinks maybe, just maybe, they can get him to talk. They're wrong. Doc Barker doesn't say a word. He's a career criminal, and he knows the code. You don't rat on your family. You don't rat on your partners, no matter what. But Byron Bolton? Byron Bolton doesn't have that same loyalty. And when the FBI starts questioning him, when they make it clear that he's looking at serious prison time, he starts talking. Bolton tells them everything: the kidnappings, the hideouts, the other gang members, and most importantly, he tells them where Ma and Fred Barker are hiding. The FBI also finds something else in Doc Barker's apartment: a map, a detailed map of Florida with one location circled, Lake Weir, a small resort area in Central Florida. They also find letters that appear to reference this location. Everything points to the same place. Ma and Fred Barker are in Florida, hiding out in a cottage on Lake Weir. J. Edgar Hoover personally orders the raid. He wants the Barker gang finished, and he sends one of his top agents, Earl Connolly, to lead the operation. On January 15, 1935, Connolly and a team of FBI agents arrive in Florida. They scout out the cottage on Lake Weir, a two-story house right on the water, isolated from other buildings. Perfect for criminals who want privacy, and perfect for a shootout. The agents surround the house under cover of darkness. They wait for dawn. They want visibility when this goes down. They want to see what they're shooting at. January 16, 1935. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. It's that gray pre-dawn light where everything looks shadowy and uncertain. The FBI agents are in position, weapons ready. They've got rifles, machine guns, tear gas. They're prepared for a war. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, the FBI calls out to the house. "This is the FBI. Come out with your hands up. The house is surrounded." No response, so they call out again. "Fred Barker, Arizona Barker. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Come out now and you won't be harmed." Still nothing, just silence from the house. And then someone inside, and we still don't know who, shouts back, "All right, go ahead." The upstairs window explodes with gunfire, a machine gun from the sound of it, spraying bullets at the FBI agents. The agents return fire immediately, and suddenly the quiet Florida morning erupts into a war zone. The shootout lasts approximately 4 hours. 4 hours of continuous gunfire. The FBI is shooting at the upstairs window. Whoever's inside is shooting back. Tear gas canisters are fired into the house, but the shooting continues. Neighbors hear the gunfire from miles away. Some think there's a war starting. Others think it's thunder, but it's neither. It's the end of the Barker-Karpis Gang. Finally, around 9:30 in the morning, the shooting stops. The house goes quiet. The FBI waits, weapons still trained on the windows, not sure if this is a trick or if it's really over. After several minutes of silence, agents cautiously approach the house. They enter through the front door, weapons ready, expecting more gunfire at any moment. But there is no more gunfire, because upstairs in a bedroom they find two bodies. Fred Barker is dead, killed by multiple gunshot wounds. He's lying near the machine gun he'd been using, one hand still clutching it. And on the floor beside him is his mother. Arizona Ma Barker is dead too, also killed by FBI bullets. The Barker-Karpis Gang, as a functioning criminal organization, has just died with them. Now I need to talk about what happened in that house, because there's controversy here. Controversy that has never been fully resolved. The FBI's official story is that Ma Barker participated in the shootout, that she was at an upstairs window with a machine gun, firing at agents alongside her son. J. Edgar Hoover would later claim that this proved she was a violent criminal, a gang leader, a mastermind who went down fighting. But here's the problem with that story. There's no physical evidence that Ma Barker fired a weapon. When investigators examined her body, her hands showed no gunpowder residue, something you'd expect to find if she'd been firing a machine gun for 4 hours. The machine gun found in the room was near Fred, not near Ma, and Ma's body was found in a different location from where the shooting was primarily concentrated. Some historians believe Ma Barker was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, that she was in the house when the raid happened and was killed by stray bullets during the firefight, that she was a victim, not a participant. Others argue that she may have been hit early in the shootout and fell away from the weapon, which would explain the lack of gunpowder residue and her position in the room. We'll never know for sure. The only two people who could tell us what really happened in that room are dead. What we do know is this: Ma Barker, whether she was a criminal mastermind or just a loyal mother, died with her son, and her death would become one of the most controversial aspects of the FBI's war on crime in the 1930s. News of the shootout spreads quickly. The newspapers have a field day. Ma Barker and son killed in FBI raid. The headlines scream, "Criminal mastermind dies in shootout." J. Edgar Hoover seizes the opportunity. He holds press conferences. He gives interviews. He paints Ma Barker as the evil genius behind the gang, a mother who corrupted her sons and led them into a life of crime. He describes her as the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. It's a great story. It makes the FBI look heroic. They've killed the mastermind and are closing in on the rest of the gang. It justifies the shootout and the deaths, and it makes for fantastic headlines. There's just one problem. Most of it probably isn't true. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll dig into the Ma Barker myth later in the episode. For now, let's talk about what happened to the rest of the gang. Part 6. The last of the gang. Karpis's final crimes and capture. Alvin Karpis hears about the Lake Weir shootout within hours. He's in hiding, constantly moving from city to city, and the news hits him hard. Fred Barker was his partner, his friend, the muscle to his brains. And now Fred is gone, killed by the FBI. Doc Barker is in custody. Ma Barker is dead. The rest of the gang has scattered or been arrested. Alvin Karpis is now the last major member of the Barker-Karpis Gang, still at large. And he's public enemy number 1, with every FBI agent in the country looking for him. Most criminals in Karpis's position would go into hiding. They'd find a hole somewhere and crawl into it, hoping the heat would die down. But Alvin Karpis isn't most criminals. He's smart, he's bold, and he needs money. So he decides to pull off more jobs. April 1935, just 3 months after the Lake Weir shootout. Karpis and what's left of his crew rob an armored car in Warren, Ohio. They get away with more than $70,000. It's a successful job, professionally executed, and it shows that Karpis is still dangerous even without his original gang. But he's not done yet. October 1935. Karpis and his remaining associates rob a train in Garrettsville, Ohio. This time they get away with over $30,000. He's thumbing his nose at the FBI, proving that even as public enemy number 1, even with the entire federal government hunting him, he can still pull off major crimes. But every crime leaves evidence. Every crime gives the FBI more information. And slowly, methodically, the FBI is tracking his movements, analyzing his patterns, predicting where he might strike next. J. Edgar Hoover has made catching Karpis a personal mission. See, Hoover has a problem. He's been positioning himself as America's top crime fighter, but he's never personally arrested anyone. Critics have mocked him for this, calling him a bureaucrat, a desk jockey who sends other men to do the dangerous work. Hoover wants to prove them wrong, and he wants to do it by personally arresting the most wanted criminal in America, Alvin Karpis. For months, the FBI tracks Karpis across the country. They follow his money. Remember, they mark those bills from the Bremer ransom. They interview his associates. They stake out locations where they think he might appear. And finally, in May of 1936, they get a solid lead. Karpis is in New Orleans. May 1st, 1936. New Orleans, Louisiana. Karpis and an associate named Fred Hunter are living in an apartment on Canal Street. They think they're safe. They think they've evaded the FBI once again. They're wrong. J. Edgar Hoover himself flies to New Orleans with a team of agents. He's determined to be there for the arrest, to be part of the action, to prove that he's not just a bureaucrat. The FBI surrounds the apartment building. They identify Karpis's car parked outside, and they wait for him to emerge. Shortly after 5 p.m., Karpis and Hunter walk out of their apartment and head toward their car. They have no idea the FBI is watching. They have no idea this is the end. As they're about to get into the car, FBI agents swarm them from all directions. FBI, don't move! Hands up! Karpis freezes. For a split second, he considers running or fighting, but he's surrounded by at least a dozen armed agents. There's nowhere to go. He puts his hands up. J. Edgar Hoover steps forward. He personally places the handcuffs on Alvin Karpis. Later, Hoover will claim that Karpis was reaching for a rifle in his car and that Hoover heroically stopped him. Karpis will later say this is complete fiction, that he never had a chance to reach for anything, that Hoover only appeared after the arrest was safely completed. Who's telling the truth? Probably Karpis. But Hoover gets his moment. He gets his headlines. Hoover personally arrests public enemy number 1. It's exactly the publicity he wanted. Alvin Karpis, the last of the Barker-Karpis gang, is in custody. The gang is finished. But the story? The story is far from over. Part 7. Trials, Sentences, and Imprisonment. Let's talk about what happened to the gang members after their arrests, because their fates varied wildly, and some of their stories are quite fascinating. Alvin Karpis is charged with kidnapping in both the Hamm and Bremer cases. He's facing life in prison at minimum, possibly even execution. But Karpis is smart. He knows the system, and he makes a deal. He pleads guilty to kidnapping charges in exchange for the prosecution not seeking the death penalty. He's sentenced to life imprisonment at Alcatraz, the infamous island prison in San Francisco Bay that housed America's most dangerous criminals. Karpis arrives at Alcatraz in August 1936. And here's the interesting thing. He's going to spend the next 26 years there. 26 years on the rock, making him the longest-serving inmate in Alcatraz's history. Now, life on Alcatraz was brutal. The isolation, the strict rules, the violence from other inmates. But Karpis adapted. He became a model prisoner, stayed out of trouble, and spent his time reading and, fascinatingly, learning to play the guitar. And this is where the story takes a strange turn. In the 1960s, after Karpis was transferred from Alcatraz to McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington, he encountered a young inmate who was struggling. This young man was in and out of trouble, directionless, and Karpis took an interest in him. Karpis taught this young inmate how to play guitar, spent hours with him, mentoring him, trying to give him something positive to focus on. That young inmate's name was Charles Manson. Yes, that Charles Manson, the same man who would later lead the Manson family cult and order the murders of Sharon Tate and others in 1969. Karpis would later write about teaching Manson guitar, saying he thought it was time someone did something for him. It's a chilling connection, isn't it? The web of crime linking across generations. Karpis was finally paroled in 1969 after serving 33 years. Think about that. 33 years in prison. He went in as a relatively young man and came out as an old one. The world had completely changed. The Depression was ancient history. World War II had come and gone. The 1960s had transformed American culture. Everything Karpis knew was gone. He was immediately deported to Canada, his birth country. After a few years there, he moved to Spain in 1973, where he lived quietly until his death in 1979. He wrote his memoirs, gave a few interviews, and spent his final years as a curiosity, a living relic from a bygone era of American crime. Now, what about Doc Barker? His story is much shorter and more tragic. Doc Barker was sent to Alcatraz shortly after his arrest in 1935. But unlike his partner Karpis, Doc didn't adapt well to prison life. He was restless, angry, desperate for freedom. On January 13, 1939, Doc Barker and 4 other inmates attempted to escape from Alcatraz. It was a foolish plan, doomed from the start. Alcatraz was called the Rock for a reason. It was considered escape-proof, surrounded by freezing water and treacherous currents. The escape attempt went wrong almost immediately. Guards spotted the inmates trying to reach the water. They opened fire. Doc Barker was shot multiple times. He died from his wounds later that day. He was 39 years old. Fred was dead. Doc was dead. Ma was dead. The Barker side of the Barker-Karpis gang had been completely wiped out. What about the other gang members? Charles Fitzgerald, who participated in the Hamm kidnapping, was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. He was sent to Alcatraz, where he served time alongside Karpis and Doc Barker until Doc's death. Byron Bolton, who cooperated with the FBI and provided the information that led to the Lake Weir raid, received a lighter sentence in exchange for his testimony. He was released after serving several years. Harry Campbell, another gang member, was captured in 1936 and sentenced to life in prison. He was eventually paroled in the 1950s. And what about Police Chief Thomas Brown, the corrupt cop who had protected the gang and allegedly helped them plan kidnappings? Brown was never prosecuted for his involvement with the gang. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him, even though everyone in law enforcement knew he was dirty. He was eventually forced to resign from the St. Paul Police Department in disgrace, but he never spent a day in prison. It's infuriating, isn't it? The man who arguably enabled so much of the gang's criminal activity, who betrayed his oath and his badge, gets away with it while others spend their entire lives behind bars. But that's often how corruption works. The people at the top, the ones in positions of power, find ways to avoid consequences while everyone beneath them suffers. The Barker-Karpis Gang, as an organization, was finished by 1936. Every major member was either dead or in prison. Their crime spree had lasted just 5 years. But in that time, they'd kidnapped 2 men, killed at least 10 people, robbed numerous banks, and terrorized the Midwest. And they'd forced the FBI to evolve, to develop new forensic techniques, to expand federal authority over interstate crimes. In a strange way, the Barker-Karpis Gang helped create the modern FBI. But there's one more story we need to tell. One more mystery we need to explore. Because the most controversial, most debated, most misunderstood figure in the entire Barker-Karpis saga isn't Fred or Doc or even Alvin Karpis. It's Ma Barker. Who was she really? Was she the criminal mastermind J. Edgar Hoover claimed? Or was she just a mother who stood by her sons no matter what they did? Let's dig into the myth of Ma Barker. Part 8. The Ma Barker Myth, Separating Fact from Fiction. Arizona. Donnie Clark, known as Kate to her family and Ma to her sons, has gone down in history as one of the most notorious female criminals in American history. There are movies about her, books about her. She's been portrayed as a gun-toting, cold-blooded mastermind who controlled her sons like puppets and directed their criminal empire. J. Edgar Hoover himself described her as the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. But here's the thing, almost none of that is probably true. The myth of Ma Barker as criminal mastermind appears to have been created almost entirely by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI for public relations purposes. And over the decades since her death, historians and researchers have systematically dismantled that myth piece by piece. Let me share with you what the people who actually knew Ma Barker had to say about her. Harvey Bailey was a bank robber who worked with the Barker-Karpis Gang on several occasions. He knew the family personally. He saw how they operated. And in his autobiography, he wrote this about Ma Barker. She couldn't plan breakfast. Let that sink in. One of the gang's own associates, a career criminal himself, said Ma Barker couldn't plan something as simple as breakfast, let alone mastermind complex kidnappings and bank robberies. But it gets better, or worse depending on how you look at it. Alvin Karpis himself, the man who spent more time with the Barker family than almost anyone, wrote extensively about Ma Barker in his memoirs. And this is what he said. She knew we were criminals, but her participation in our careers was limited to one function. When we traveled together, we moved as a mother and her sons. What could look more innocent? According to Karpis, Ma Barker was cover. She was camouflage. She made the gang look like a normal family traveling around the Midwest, which allowed them to avoid suspicion. But she wasn't planning crimes. She wasn't giving orders. She wasn't the brains behind anything. Karpis went even further. He suggested that Hoover encouraged the Ma Barker myth specifically to justify her death. Think about that. The FBI had just killed a 61-year-old woman in a shootout. They needed to explain why. They needed the public to believe she was dangerous, that she deserved what happened to her. So they made her into a monster. They created the legend of Ma Barker, criminal mastermind. Now, I want to be fair here. Ma Barker wasn't innocent. Let's be very clear about that. She knew her sons were criminals. She knew they were killers, and she did nothing to stop them. She didn't turn them in. She didn't try to reform them. She didn't encourage them to go straight. In fact, she enabled them. She traveled with them. She provided cover for them. She enjoyed the money they stole. She lived in nice hotels, wore fancy clothes, and benefited directly from their criminal activities. So she was an accomplice. She was complicit. There's no doubt about that. But there's a huge difference between being complicit and being a mastermind. There's a difference between enabling your son's crimes and directing those crimes. And all the evidence suggests that Ma Barker was in the first category, not the second. Let me give you an example of how the myth was built. In the immediate aftermath of the Lake Weir shootout, newspapers ran stories calling Ma Barker the mastermind and the brains of the gang. But where did those stories come from? They came from FBI press releases, from statements by J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI controlled the narrative. They told the press what to write, and the press wrote it. There was no independent investigation into who Ma Barker really was or what her actual role in the gang had been. And once the story was out there, it took on a life of its own. Hollywood picked it up. Books repeated it. Generation after generation heard about Ma Barker, the evil mother who corrupted her sons. So what was the truth? What was Ma Barker's real role? Based on historical research and accounts from people who knew her, here's what seems most likely. Ma Barker was a fiercely protective mother who refused to acknowledge her son's faults. From the time they were young boys getting in trouble at school, she made excuses for them. She blamed others. She enabled their bad behavior. As they grew older and turned to crime, she continued this pattern. She didn't approve of their crimes necessarily, but she loved them unconditionally. And that unconditional love meant standing by them no matter what. When they needed a place to stay, she provided it. When they needed cover to move around the country, she traveled with them. When they had money from robberies and kidnappings, she accepted it and lived off it. She was at crime scenes, not planning or participating, but present. She was at meetings with other criminals. She knew what was being discussed, even if she wasn't making decisions. Was she at that upstairs window with Fred during the Lake Weir shootout, firing a machine gun at FBI agents? Almost certainly not. The physical evidence doesn't support it. Was she in the house when the shooting started, and did she die in the crossfire? Almost certainly yes. Here's what I think is the most tragic part of Ma Barker's story. She loved her sons so much that she destroyed them. Her unconditional love, her refusal to set boundaries or hold them accountable, her constant excuses and enabling. All of that helped turn her boys into criminals and killers. Herman Barker, the oldest son, died in 1927 in a shootout with police. He was 33. Fred Barker died at 32 in the Lake Weir shootout. Doc Barker died at 39 trying to escape from Alcatraz. Lloyd Barker, the only one who survived past 40, spent most of his life in prison and was killed by his wife in 1949. 4 sons, all criminals, all dead before their time, and a mother who loved them enough to ruin them. That's the real tragedy of Ma Barker. Not that she was some evil mastermind, but that her toxic love helped create monsters. The myth of Ma Barker tells us something important about how history is written. It shows us that the official story, the story told by people in power, isn't always the truth. Sometimes it's propaganda. Sometimes it's public relations. Sometimes it's just a convenient lie that serves someone's purposes. J. Edgar Hoover needed Ma Barker to be a monster to justify her death and to build the FBI's reputation. So he made her into one. And for decades, that myth was accepted as fact. It's only in recent years, as historians have dug deeper and examined the actual evidence, that the truth has emerged. Ma Barker probably wasn't the person Hoover claimed she was, but she also wasn't innocent. She was complicated, flawed, human. She was a mother who loved her children too much and enabled them into early graves. That's the real story, and in some ways it's sadder than the myth. Part 9. Legacy and Impact. How the Barker-Karpis Gang Changed America. We're nearly at the end of our story, but before we close, I want to talk about what the Barker-Karpis Gang's crimes meant for America. Because their impact went far beyond the people they kidnapped and killed. They fundamentally changed how law enforcement operates in this country. Let's start with forensic science. Before the Barker-Karpis kidnappings, fingerprint technology was still fairly rudimentary. Police could lift fingerprints from hard surfaces like glass or metal, but lifting prints from paper was considered nearly impossible. The successful use of the silver nitrate method on the Hamm and Bremer ransom notes changed everything. Suddenly, criminals couldn't safely handle any surface. Paper, fabric, even skin. Everything was potentially a source of fingerprint evidence. This breakthrough led to massive advancements in forensic science. The FBI laboratory expanded rapidly, new techniques were developed, training programs were established, and all of it can be traced back in part to the Barker-Karpis case. Today, when we watch crime shows on TV and see investigators using all sorts of sophisticated forensic techniques, we're seeing the descendants of the technology that caught the Barker-Karpis gang. The gang also changed federal law enforcement in fundamental ways. Before the 1930s, the FBI had very limited authority. They were mostly accountants and lawyers who investigated white-collar crimes. Bank robbery was a local crime, handled by local police. Kidnapping was a local crime. Murder was a local crime. But the wave of crime in the early 1930s, including the Barker-Karpis kidnappings, changed everything. The Bremer kidnapping, in particular, because of Edward Bremer's family connection to President Roosevelt, became a national crisis. Congress passed new laws giving the FBI expanded authority. Bank robbery became a federal crime if the bank was insured by the federal government. Kidnapping became a federal crime if the victim was transported across state lines. Murder became a federal crime if it was committed during certain other federal offenses. The FBI got more funding, more agents, more resources, and they got the authority to carry weapons and make arrests, things they couldn't always do before. J. Edgar Hoover used the crime wave of the 1930s, and specifically cases like the Barker-Karpis kidnappings, to transform the FBI from a small agency into a powerful federal law enforcement organization. For better or worse, the modern FBI, with all its power, all its authority, all its reach, exists in part because of criminals like the Barker-Karpis gang. The gang's story also had a cultural impact that lasted for decades. The idea of the criminal mastermind mother became a trope in American pop culture. Movies like Ma Barker's Killer Brood in 1960 and Bloody Mama in 1970, which starred Shelley Winters and a young Robert De Niro, portrayed Ma Barker as a violent, controlling matriarch who directed her son's crimes. These films influenced how generations of Americans understood Depression-era crime. Even though the real Ma Barker was probably nothing like these portrayals, the myth became reality in the public imagination. The 1930s crime wave also shaped how we think about criminals in general. Before this era, criminals were seen as simple thugs. Violent, yes, but not particularly interesting or glamorous. But the Depression-era gangsters changed that perception. They became folk heroes to some people, anti-establishment figures striking back at a system that had failed ordinary Americans. They were romanticized, mythologized, turned into legends, and that romanticization continues today. We make movies about these criminals. We write books about them. We create podcasts about them. There's a fascination with their stories that goes beyond simple curiosity about crime. Why? What is it about the Barker-Karpis gang and other Depression-era criminals that still captures our imagination nearly 90 years later? I think it's partly the time period. The Depression was such a desperate, difficult era that we can almost understand why people turn to crime. When the system fails you, when you're hungry and broke, and the banks have taken everything, maybe bank robbery doesn't seem so wrong. But it's also about the contrast between myth and reality. The Barker-Karpis gang story is compelling because so much of what we thought we knew was wrong. Ma Barker wasn't a mastermind. The FBI's version of events was propaganda. The truth is more complicated, more nuanced, more human than the legend. And maybe that's the real lesson here. History is complicated. People are complicated. The official story is often incomplete or even false. The Barker-Karpis gang left behind more than just bodies and stolen money. They left behind questions. Questions about justice, about law enforcement, about how history is written and who gets to write it. They forced America to confront the reality of crime in the modern age. They proved that local law enforcement couldn't handle organized mobile criminals who cross state lines at will. They demonstrated the need for federal authority and sophisticated forensic science. And perhaps most importantly, they showed us how easily myths can be created and how long those myths can persist, even in the face of contrary evidence. The gang operated for just 5 years, but their impact has lasted nearly a century, and their story continues to fascinate, challenge, and teach us today. Part 10. Lessons Learned. What the Barker-Karpis story teaches us today. We've spent almost 2 hours together exploring the rise and fall of the Barker-Karpis gang. We've talked about desperate times, violent crimes, revolutionary forensic science, and the myths that can shape history. But what does this Depression-era crime story mean for us today, in 2025? What can we learn from events that happened 90 years ago? I think there are several important lessons here. Let me share them with you. Lesson 1. Economic desperation breeds crime. The Barker-Karpis gang emerged during the Great Depression when millions of Americans were unemployed, hungry, and hopeless. Crime rates soared during this period because people were desperate. Now, I'm not excusing what the gang did. They were violent criminals who killed innocent people. But we can't ignore the context. We can't pretend that economic conditions don't matter. Today, we see similar patterns. When communities are economically depressed, when jobs disappear, when people feel they have no legitimate path to success, crime increases. If we want to prevent the next generation of Barker-Karpis gangs, we need to address economic inequality and provide opportunities for people to succeed legitimately. That's not soft on crime, that's smart on crime. Lesson 2. Family dysfunction can have catastrophic consequences. Ma Barker's story is, at its core, a story about toxic love. She loved her sons so much that she refused to hold them accountable. She made excuses for them. She enabled their worst behaviors. And ultimately, that unconditional, unwise love helped turn them into killers. How many of us know parents like that? Parents who can't say no to their children? Parents who always blame teachers, coaches, other kids, anyone but their own child, when problems arise. The Barker story shows us where that path can lead. Children need boundaries. They need accountability. They need to learn that actions have consequences. Loving your children doesn't mean protecting them from the consequences of their choices. Sometimes it means letting them face those consequences so they can learn and grow. And I say this as someone who understands the difficulty. It's hard to watch your children struggle. It's hard to let them fail. But sometimes that's exactly what they need. Lesson 3. Question official narratives. The Ma Barker myth shows us how easily false stories can become accepted history. J. Edgar Hoover told a story that served his purposes, the media repeated it, and for decades everyone believed it. It was only when historians started digging deeper, asking questions, examining actual evidence rather than just accepting official statements, that the truth began to emerge. This is relevant today, maybe more than ever. We live in an age of information overload where it's hard to know what's true. Official sources tell us one thing, alternative sources tell us another. How do we know what to believe? The Ma Barker story teaches us to be skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical, to ask questions, to look for evidence, to consider who benefits from a particular narrative. Just because someone in authority says something doesn't make it true. Just because it's repeated often doesn't make it fact. We need to think critically, examine evidence, and be willing to change our minds when new information emerges. Lesson 4. Technology changes crime and law enforcement. The silver nitrate fingerprint method revolutionized criminal investigation. Suddenly, criminals couldn't hide. They left evidence everywhere they went. Today, we're seeing the same thing with DNA evidence, facial recognition, cell phone tracking, and digital forensics. Technology is making it harder and harder to commit crimes without leaving evidence. But that same technology raises privacy concerns. How much surveillance is too much? Where's the line between security and freedom? The Barker-Karpis case shows us that advances in law enforcement technology are inevitable, but it also reminds us that we need to think carefully about how that technology is used and who controls it. Lesson 5. Corruption undermines everything. Remember Police Chief Thomas Brown? He enabled the Barker-Karpis gang. He protected them. He allegedly helped them plan crimes. And he got away with it. Corrupt officials are often more dangerous than the criminals they protect. They betray public trust. They undermine the legitimacy of law enforcement. They make it harder to catch criminals because the criminals have inside information. Today, we still struggle with police corruption, political corruption, and institutional corruption. The Barker story reminds us how destructive that corruption can be and how important it is to hold officials accountable. Lesson 6. Violence begets violence. The Barker-Karpis gang killed at least 10 people during their crime spree. Law enforcement killed several gang members. Victims died. Innocent bystanders died. Violence created more violence, which created more violence. Fred Barker was violent, so law enforcement responded with violence, which led to a shootout that killed Fred and his mother. Doc Barker tried to escape prison violently and was killed violently. The cycle never ended until everyone was dead or in prison. This lesson applies beyond organized crime. It applies to how we think about punishment, about justice, about responding to violence in our communities. Does meeting violence with violence solve anything? Or does it just create more violence? These are questions the Barker-Karpis story forces us to confront. Lesson 7. Second chances matter, but so does accountability. Alvin Karpis spent 33 years in prison. When he got out, he was an old man. The world had changed. Everyone he knew was dead or gone. He didn't reoffend. He lived quietly for his final decade, harming no one. This raises a question. What is the purpose of imprisonment? Is it punishment, rehabilitation, protection of society? Karpis was punished. He lost 33 years of his life. But was society safer because he spent that long in prison? Would 10 years have been enough? 15? These are difficult questions with no easy answers. But the Barker-Karpis story forces us to think about them. The story of the Barker-Karpis gang is more than just a true crime tale. It's a window into a different America. An America struggling with economic catastrophe, grappling with new types of crime, and trying to figure out how to respond. Many of the same challenges they faced in the 1930s, we face today. Economic inequality, family dysfunction, corruption, violence, questions about law enforcement and civil liberties. The specific crimes might be different, the technology might be different, but the fundamental human questions remain the same. How do we balance security and freedom? How do we address the root causes of crime while still holding criminals accountable? How do we separate truth from propaganda? How do we create a just society? The Barker-Karpis gang doesn't give us easy answers to these questions, but their story helps us understand why these questions matter and why we need to keep asking them. Closing the story. Well, we've reached the end of our journey with the Barker-Karpis gang. 2 hours we've spent together exploring one of the most fascinating and controversial criminal organizations in American history. Let me quickly recap what we've covered today. We started in the depths of the Great Depression, where poverty and desperation created the conditions for a crime wave. We met Ma Barker and her 4 sons, all of whom turned to crime. We saw how Fred Barker and Alvin Karpis formed a partnership that would terrorize the Midwest for 5 years. We explored their evolution from bank robbers to kidnappers. We learned about the Hamm kidnapping and the Bremer kidnapping, crimes that shocked the nation and drew the attention of President Roosevelt himself. We discovered how the Barker-Karpis case led to a revolutionary breakthrough in forensic science, the silver nitrate method for lifting fingerprints from paper. This technology helped the FBI identify the gang members and change criminal investigation forever. We witnessed the dramatic end of Fred and Ma Barker in the Lake Weir shootout, and we explored the controversy surrounding Ma's death. We followed Alvin Karpis's final crimes and his eventual capture by J. Edgar Hoover himself. We examined the myth of Ma Barker as criminal mastermind and discovered that the truth was far more complicated and in many ways more tragic. We saw how J. Edgar Hoover used the gang's story to build the FBI's reputation, even if it meant distorting the truth. And finally, we reflected on what this Depression-era crime story can teach us today about economic justice, family dysfunction, questioning authority, technology, corruption, violence, and accountability. The Barker-Karpis Gang operated for just 5 years, from 1931 to 1936, but their impact has lasted nearly a century. They changed how we fight crime. They changed forensic science. They changed the FBI. And they left us with questions about truth, justice, and how history is written. 4 Barker sons, all criminals, all dead before their time. A mother whose unconditional love destroyed her children. A criminal mastermind who taught guitar to Charles Manson. And a law enforcement agency that used their story to reshape American policing. It's a story of violence and tragedy, yes. But it's also a story about America itself. Our struggles, our failures, our evolution. And that's why, 90 years later, we're still talking about it. Before I let you go, I want to hear from you. What did you think about Ma Barker's story? Do you believe she was involved in planning the crimes? Or was she just a mother standing by her sons? Do you think the FBI was justified in the Lake Weir shootout? Or did they go too far? You can share your thoughts with me on social media. Just search for Crime Tales Podcast. I love hearing from listeners, and some of your comments might even be featured in future episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe to Crime Tales wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave us a review if you can. It really helps other listeners find the show. And share this episode with someone who loves true crime stories. Maybe your book club friends, your sister, that neighbor who always asks for podcast recommendations. Next time on Crime Tales, we're heading to the Wild West to explore the legend of Belle Starr, the woman known as the Bandit Queen, who rode with Jesse James and became one of the most feared outlaws of her era. Was she really as dangerous as the stories claimed? Or, like Ma Barker, was her reputation exaggerated? You won't want to miss it. Crime Tales is researched and hosted by me. Special thanks to the FBI Archives, the Minnesota Historical Society, and the numerous historians whose research made this episode possible. Until next time, remember, the truth is often stranger than the legend, and sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones we never suspect. This has been Crime Tales. Stay safe out there.